The hum of the old copier is often the only sound that breaks the late evening silence in the corridors of Northwood High, a constant, rhythmic pulse in the otherwise still heart of the inner-city school. It's a sound intimately familiar to Ms. Anya Sharma, a teacher who stays long after the final bell, long after the janitors have made their rounds. Her own money feeding the machine that spits out worksheets and reading materials for students others had long since dismissed. Her dedication is a quiet beacon in a place worn down by neglect and indifference, a passion that burns a little too brightly for an administration that prefers smoldering embers to an open flame. They see her efforts not as commitment, but as something unsettling, too loud in her advocacy, too involved in lives beyond the curriculum, simply too much for their carefully managed apathy, until a single moment, a forced smile and a vague excuse, seems to extinguish her light. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe quiet genius always finds a way, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Anya's presence at Northwood was a testament to a belief system forged in her own challenging youth, a conviction that potential existed everywhere, often hidden beneath layers of hardship or societal neglect. She saw herself in these students, in their guarded eyes and unspoken dreams. The school, however, was a landscape of dwindling resources and even lower expectations, a place where her tireless efforts were an unspoken reproach to the systemic inertia. Her classroom, though, was an oasis, funded by her modest paycheck, vibrant with hand-drawn posters, overflowing bookshelves, and the low murmur of engaged discussion. For years, she had poured her soul into these kids, the ones labeled difficult, disruptive, or unteachable, and she had seen them bloom. But what happened next would change everything. Anya Sharma had arrived at Northwood High 7 years prior, armed with a freshly minted teaching degree and an idealism that the school's weary cynicism had yet to tarnish. She grew up in a similar neighborhood, a few states over, where the clang of a school gate closing often sounded more like a prison door than an invitation to opportunity. She knew the weight of low expectations, the sting of being overlooked. Her own salvation had come in the form of a history teacher who saw past her teenage defiance to the sharp mind beneath. That experience became her guiding principle. Every student deserved a champion. She taught English, but her lessons often transcended literature, weaving in threads of resilience, critical thinking, and self-worth. She remembered the names of their siblings, the struggles their parents faced, the small triumphs that went unnoticed by others. Her emotional investment was profound, a quiet force that chipped away at the students' carefully constructed walls. Among her students, Marcus was a particularly poignant case. He was a lanky 16-year-old with a sharp intellect he usually hid behind a veneer of sullen disinterest. Other teachers had written him off as a lost cause, his file thick with notes on truancy and a defiant attitude. But Anya saw the flicker of curiosity in his eyes during a discussion about James Baldwin, the way his hand hovered over a blank page before he'd snatch it back, afraid to commit his thoughts to paper. She'd stayed late with him, not with pressure, but with quiet encouragement, finding articles she thought would pique his interest, offering him books from her personal collection. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Marcus had begun to emerge, his voice hesitant at first, then gaining confidence in her classroom. He became a quiet observer, a thinker, and for Anya, he represented the very reason she fought so hard. The opposing force in Anya's daily battle was less a single villain and more the pervasive culture of the school administration, embodied by Principal Thompson. He was a man who favored smooth optics over substantive change, a career administrator adept at managing upwards and deflecting downwards. He spoke in platitudes about student success and community engagement during board meetings, but within Northwood's walls, his focus was on maintaining order with minimal disruption and, more importantly, minimal expenditure of resources beyond the barest necessities. Anya's methods, her passionate advocacy for individual student needs, her tendency to question policies that seemed detrimental to her kids, these were all seen as disruptive. A few months prior, during a staff meeting about standardized testing, Anya had gently questioned the fairness of evaluating students from impoverished backgrounds with the same metrics as those from affluent districts. Principal Thompson had cut her off with a curt, "Ms. Sharma, we all have budgets to adhere to and benchmarks to meet. Perhaps focus on preparing your students for the reality they face." The comment, delivered with a dismissive wave of his hand, had been a clear, albeit indirect, signal of his displeasure. The school itself felt like a metaphor for the students it housed, full of potential but visibly crumbling. Paint peeled from classroom walls, textbooks were outdated and tattered, and the heating system was notoriously unreliable, often leaving students shivering in winter. Yet, Anya's classroom was always warm, if not from the ancient radiators, then from the sheer energy she brought into it. She cultivated a small herb garden on the windowsill with students, its greenery a stark contrast to the gray concrete outside. She understood that her dedication, her refusal to let the school's limitations define her students' possibilities, was a quiet rebellion. She knew it made some of her colleagues uncomfortable, and it certainly irritated the administration, but she believed her students were worth the friction. There was an unspoken understanding among her pupils that Ms. Sharma saw more in them than even they saw in themselves, a powerful seed of hope in an otherwise barren landscape. The summons to Principal Thompson's office arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a nervous-looking school secretary. Anya had a premonition, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She'd been too vocal in the last PTA meeting about the lack of funding for after-school tutoring programs, the one she was essentially running single-handedly. Principal Thompson's office was neat, sterile, and devoid of any personal touches, much like the man himself. He didn't ask her to sit, his smile thin and unconvincing. "Anya," he began, the use of her first name a deliberate, distancing tactic. "As you know, the district is undergoing some significant restructuring. Budgets are tight, and we've had to make some very difficult decisions regarding staffing." His eyes, cold and direct, met hers. "Unfortunately, your contract will not be renewed for the next academic year. Your position is being eliminated due to these realignments." The words, though not entirely unexpected, landed like a physical blow. "Restructuring? Position eliminated?" Anya managed, her voice quiet but steady. "Mr. Thompson, I run the only consistent tutoring for at-risk juniors and seniors. I've secured grants for new books." He held up a hand, cutting her off. "The decision is final, Anya. It's purely a budgetary and administrative matter, not a reflection on your efforts." The pause before efforts was laden with unspoken criticism. He slid a folder across the desk. "Everything you need is in here. We appreciate your service to Northwood." The forced smile returned, wider this time, almost predatory. Anya looked at him, seeing not just an administrator, but the embodiment of a system that prioritized appearances over the very children it was meant to serve. Her initial shock gave way to a deep ache, not for her job, but for her students. What would happen to them? The administration's unease, the subtle warnings, had culminated in this cold, bureaucratic execution. She picked up the folder, her mind already racing, not about her next steps, but about how she would break the news to Marcus, to Aisha, to all the young faces who relied on her. Later that day, during what she knew would be one of her last unofficial tutoring sessions, Anya gathered a small group of her most dedicated students. Marcus was there, along with Aisha, a quiet, observant girl who blossomed under Anya's encouragement, her insightful essays revealing a profound understanding of the texts they studied. Anya tried to keep her voice even, her emotions in check. "I have some difficult news," she began, and saw the immediate concern flash across their faces. She explained, as gently as she could, that her time at Northwood was coming to an end, citing school changes, without wanting to burden them with the injustice of it all. Marcus's reaction was visceral. His usual guarded expression crumbled. "What? No. They can't," he stammered, looking at Aisha, then back at Anya, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning anger. "Miss Sharma, you're the only teacher who actually gets it." Aisha, usually reserved, nodded vehemently, her lips pressed into a thin line. Anya felt a pang, a deep sense of failure, even though she knew this wasn't her fault. She tried to reassure them, to tell them they were strong and capable, but their faces reflected a betrayal that she knew was not just personal, but systemic. It was a subtle test of her composure, to absorb their pain while managing her own, and to respond not with bitterness, but with the same grace she'd always tried to model. The news of Miss Sharma's impending departure spread through Northwood's hallways like a cold wind. What began as hushed whispers in classrooms and shocked exchanges by lockers soon coalesced into a current of shared disbelief and anger. Marcus, usually so withdrawn, found himself at the center of these conversations. He replayed Miss Sharma's words, Principal Thompson's bland euphemisms ringing false in his ears. "Restructuring? Position eliminated?" He repeated to Aisha and a few others from Anya's tutoring group. "That's bull. They're firing her because she actually cares." Aisha, ever the pragmatist, suggested they try to talk to Principal Thompson directly. The small group of students, nervous but resolute, approached his office the next morning. The principal's secretary, clearly flustered, tried to turn them away, but Thompson, perhaps sensing a minor inconvenience that could be swiftly managed, agreed to see them for 5 minutes. He listened with feigned patience as Marcus, his voice trembling slightly, explained how much Miss Sharma meant to them, how she was making a real difference. Thompson's response was patronizing. "I understand your attachment, students, but these are adult decisions, complex financial matters. Miss Sharma will be fine, and Northwood will continue to provide you with a quality education." He ushered them out, the dismissal clear. That afternoon, frustrated by Thompson's indifference, Marcus, Aisha, and about 20 other students staged a quiet sit-in in the cafeteria during lunch break. They held makeshift signs, "We stand with Miss Sharma. Real teachers don't get restructured." The administration's response was swift. Assistant principals fanned out, ordering students back to class, threatening detention. The protest was dispersed within half an hour, but the spark had been lit. Marcus, remembering a lesson from Ms. Sharma's class on civil disobedience and the power of collective action, felt a surge of determination. "This isn't over," he told Aisha. "He can't just ignore all of us." Later that week, Aisha, who had a knack for navigating the school's Byzantine website, found the publicly posted minutes from the last school board meeting. There was no mention of budget cuts necessitating teacher layoffs. In fact, one line item detailed an increase in discretionary funding for innovative community outreach programs, exactly the kind of work Ms. Sharma championed and often funded herself. The official reason for her firing was not just flimsy, it appeared to be an outright lie. Their attempts to reach the district superintendent or individual school board members were met with bureaucratic deflection, calls unreturned, emails met with automated responses. The system seemed designed to be impenetrable. Anya, meanwhile, was navigating the grim reality of unemployment. She spent her days updating her resume, applying for other positions, the financial uncertainty a heavy weight. But her primary concern remained her students. Marcus called her one evening, his voice full of frustration after another failed attempt to get answers. Anya listened patiently, her heart aching for their struggle but also swelling with pride. She refrained from telling them what to do, understanding that this fight needed to be theirs. "Marcus," she said softly, "remember what we talked about? About finding your voice? About the power of truth? You and Aisha, you're smart, you're passionate. Trust yourselves." Her words, though not a directive, were a quiet affirmation of their agency. The following Monday, Principal Thompson cornered Marcus and Aisha in the hallway. His earlier condescension was gone, replaced by a thin veneer of authority barely concealing his irritation. "I hear you two are still stirring up trouble about Miss Sharma," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This needs to stop. Spreading misinformation and disrupting the school environment will have serious consequences. Consider this your final warning." He tried to paint Anya as a disgruntled employee, suggesting she was manipulating them. But his threats had the opposite effect. The students, already incensed by the perceived injustice, were now galvanized by Thompson's dismissiveness and blatant attempt at intimidation. That evening, during a clandestine meeting in Aisha's living room, they decided their next move. The upcoming school board meeting was in 3 days. Aisha, ever resourceful, pulled out her phone. "We need to make sure they can't ignore us this time," she said. "I'm going to film everything. Our speeches, their reactions. If they won't listen to us in person, maybe they'll listen when everyone can see it." The plan was audacious, and the risks were clear, but the thought of Ms. Sharma, and the principle of what was right, pushed them forward. They weren't just fighting for a teacher anymore. They were fighting for their own voices to be heard. The next day, during an impromptu gathering in the schoolyard, Marcus stood on a worn wooden bench, his voice, initially hesitant, growing stronger as more students stopped to listen. Aisha filmed him with her phone. He spoke about Ms. Sharma, not as an abstract ideal, but as the teacher who'd given him a reason to come to school, who'd shown him he wasn't a failure. He talked about her late nights, her personal sacrifices, the books she'd bought them when the library was bare. "They say she's gone because of budget cuts," Marcus declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "But we found out that's a lie. They're getting rid of her because she fights for us, because she believes in us when no one else does. Is that the kind of school we want?" A chorus of "no" rose from the crowd. The video, raw and impassioned, was uploaded that evening. Within hours, it began to circulate among Northwood students, then parents, then local community groups. The comments section filled with messages of support for Ms. Sharma and outrage at the administration. The students also discovered an email, inadvertently forwarded by a sympathetic junior staff member in the district office to a parent who then shared it with Aisha. It was from Principal Thompson to the district superintendent, dated a week before Anya's dismissal. In it, Thompson complained about Ms. Sharma's unorthodox methods and tendency to overstep her role, suggesting she was fostering unrealistic expectations among a challenging student population. He recommended her contract non-renewal to streamline departmental objectives. This was their smoking gun, clear evidence that Anya's firing was punitive, not budgetary. The school board meeting was now less than 48 hours away. The pressure was immense. Marcus, Aisha, and a core group of students spent every spare moment preparing. They drafted speeches, compiled their evidence, the board minutes, Thompson's email, testimonials from other students. They knew they could face disciplinary action, suspension, even expulsion, for challenging the administration so publicly. But the alternative, letting Ms. Sharma's dismissal stand unchallenged, letting their voices be silenced, was unthinkable. The viral video was gaining traction. A local news blogger had even retweeted it with a call for investigation. The administration at Northwood was silent, but the tension was palpable, a storm gathering just before it broke. The school board meeting room was an arena of beige walls and muted fluorescent lighting, a sterile space designed for bureaucratic pronouncements, not youthful rebellion. The board members sat on a raised dais, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly irritated as they worked through the early agenda items. Principal Thompson was seated in the front row of the public section, a look of strained composure on his face, occasionally glancing back at the small, determined group of Northwood students who had signed up to speak. Marcus, Aisha, and 3 other students sat together, their prepared notes trembling slightly in their hands. Anya was not there. She had made the difficult decision to stay away, believing fervently that this moment belonged to her students, a testament to the agency she had fought so hard to instill in them. When their turn came, Marcus walked to the podium, Aisha by his side. The room fell into a tense quiet. He began, his voice low but clear, addressing the board members with a respect that belied the anger simmering beneath the surface. He spoke of Ms. Sharma, not with sentimental platitudes, but with specific examples of her impact. Ms. Sharma taught us that our voices matter, he said, his gaze sweeping across the impassive faces of the board. She taught us to question, to seek truth, and to stand up for what's right. That's why we're here tonight. He detailed their attempts to get answers from Principal Thompson, the dismissals, the threats. Then, Aisha stepped forward. With calm precision, she presented their findings. The school board minutes showing no budget cuts for teaching positions, the increased funding for outreach, and finally, with a steady hand, she placed copies of Principal Thompson's email before each board member. This isn't about budgets, Aisha stated, her voice ringing with quiet power. This is about a principal who wanted to silence a teacher who was too effective, too dedicated to students he had given up on. She then played a 1-minute clip from the viral video on her phone, holding it up to the microphone. Marcus's passionate plea in the schoolyard, the roar of student support, filled the sterile room. The board members shifted uncomfortably. The raw emotion was undeniable. The students' courage was palpable, their determination to fight for their teacher, despite the potential personal cost, hung heavy in the air. Principal Thompson squirmed in his seat, his earlier composure cracking. One board member, a woman known for her community advocacy, leaned into her microphone. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her tone sharp, "this email, your stated reasons for Ms. Sharma's non-renewal, they seem to be in direct contradiction. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Thompson stood, flustered. He stammered about internal personnel matters, about misunderstandings, but his justifications sounded hollow, falling apart under the weight of the students' carefully presented evidence and the undeniable sentiment captured in the video. Other parents in the audience began to murmur, then to speak out, sharing their own frustrations with the school's administration and their support for Ms. Sharma and the students. The board chair, sensing a public relations disaster unfolding, quickly called for a brief recess. The decisive turning point had arrived. The students, armed with truth and courage, had cornered an administration that had underestimated them, and in doing so, had affirmed not just Ms. Sharma, but their own inherent power. When the meeting reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. The board chair, his expression now serious and concerned, announced an immediate and thorough review of Ms. Sharma's dismissal. There was a collective exhale from the student section, a wave of quiet triumph. Marcus and Aisha exchanged a look, a mixture of relief, pride, and sheer exhaustion. The fight wasn't entirely over, but they had won a crucial battle. The chair continued, stating, "Furthermore, this board commits to a full investigation into the handling of this situation by the Northwood administration, and we will be forming a committee, which will include student representation, to review our district's policies on teacher evaluation, support, and dismissal." This was more than they had dared to hope for, not just a personal victory for Ms. Sharma, but a chance for systemic change. Later that night, Anya received a call. It wasn't from Principal Thompson, but from Ms. Evans, the board member who had first questioned him. Her tone was apologetic, respectful. She not only offered Anya her position back, effective immediately, but also asked if she would consider serving on the newly formed Policy Review Committee. "Ms. Sharma," Evans said, "your students have shown us the profound impact a dedicated teacher can have. We need your voice, your experience, to help us ensure this doesn't happen again." Anya accepted, a quiet sense of vindication washing over her. The path ahead would be challenging, she knew. True change was incremental. But her students had lit a fire, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a profound, unshakable hope. A few days later, Anya walked back through the familiar doors of Northwood High. There was no grand welcome, no fanfare, just the quiet, beaming smiles of her students as she entered her old classroom. Marcus caught her eye and gave a small, respectful nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. Aisha handed her a newly potted herb for the windowsill. The hum of the old copier still echoed faintly from down the hall, but now it mingled with a new sound, the murmur of a classroom revitalized, a shared understanding passing between teacher and students, allies who had faced down indifference and emerged stronger. Anya picked up a piece of chalk, the familiar weight grounding her. She turned to the expectant faces, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "All right," she said, her voice warm and steady. "Where were we? Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more."